So if I were to ask you about space exploration, the first thing you'd probably think of is a rover on the surface of Mars, or maybe even an orbiter in orbit around Saturn. One thing you might not think about, though, is the planet Venus. And for sort of good reason. Venus is not friendly to outside explorers. Venus, if you don't know, is the second planet from the Sun, and despite being further away from the Sun than Mercury, it is the hottest planet in our solar system, with the average surface temperature being hot enough to melt lead. This is due to an extreme runaway greenhouse gas effect in Venus's atmosphere, where carbon dioxide not only blocks out a lot of the Sun's light, but also traps it around the planet. Another thing to consider is that Venus's atmosphere is very, very dense. Standing on the surface of Venus without a pressure suit would be like standing 1 kilometer under the oceans on Earth. And also, Venus's atmosphere is incredibly corrosive, meaning it erodes almost any metal that comes into contact with it. But despite this, a lot of our interplanetary missions have had successes at Venus. So now let me ask you this. Where was our first successful interplanetary mission sent? You may answer Mars, or maybe even Jupiter or Saturn, but the correct answer is actually Venus. In fact, we've sent over 40 missions to Venus since the 1960s. This is because, on average, Venus is much closer to Earth than, say, Mars or Jupiter or Saturn. And the velocity to reach Venus is relatively low. It has a low delta V, basically. This made Venus the primary target for many early space missions in the 1960s and 70s. In the early 1960s, the space race between the United States and the former Soviet Union was in full swing. Both countries were trying to overpower each other with the better technologies. And out of this, the first interplanetary mission was born, a mission to Venus by the Soviet Union called Venera 9, which was launched on February 12, 1961. Venera, by the way, is Russian for Venus. Keep that in mind. Venera 1 was successfully placed into a interplanetary trajectory, but en route to Venus, the orientation system for the antenna failed, and the ground crew lost contact with the spacecraft. Despite the failure, though, Venera 1 did pass Venus on May 19, 1961, marking the first time a human-made object had ever flew past another planet. So following the attempt by the Soviet Union, the Americans tried their hand at sending a spacecraft to another planet. Just so you know, sending a spacecraft to another planet is not as easy as these dedicated teams of engineers make it look. But anyway, the launch of Mariner 1 on July 22nd, 1962 was met with failure because during takeoff, the rocket was actually veering northwest off its planned course and was ordered to self-destruct a couple minutes after takeoff. They tried again on August 27th, 1962 with Mariner 2. And this time, the spacecraft was a success and had a successful trajectory onto Venus, and it flew by Venus on December 14th, 1962, and returned the first images from another planet, marking the first time a human-made spacecraft visited another planet other than Earth. The first spacecraft to actually land on the surface of Venus was Venera 3, which was launched on November 16th, 1965. The next year, on March 1st, 1966, Venera 3 arrived at Venus and became the first spacecraft to enter the Venusian atmosphere. But during atmospheric entry, contact with the spacecraft was lost and it crash-landed on the surface of Venus and unfortunately did not return any data. But it did mark the first time that a human-made object touched the surface of another planet. Future probes from the Venera program, like Venera 5 and 6, came very close to landing on the surface successfully, but both the spacecraft failed, each of which only lasted about 50 minutes after entering the Venusian atmosphere. Finally, the first soft landing on another planet came with the Venera 7 spacecraft. The Venera 7 spacecraft entered the atmosphere successfully, but unfortunately during entry, the parachute which was carrying the spacecraft melted, and it caused the lander to hit the surface of Venus at a speed of 37 miles per hour, which is not very safe for a landing speed for a spacecraft. Contact with the spacecraft was initially lost, But a few days later, Soviet engineers managed to pick up a very faint signal from the spacecraft. It transmitted data for 53 minutes before failing and recorded a peak temperature of 887 degrees Fahrenheit, making the hope of liquid water on the surface of Venus vanish. By the time the Venera 8 spacecraft reached Venus on March 27, 1972, improved landing technology was used for the spacecraft's descent system. And after a stressful 1-hour-long descent, Venera 8 made the first fully successful soft landing on the surface of Venus. It found light levels on the surface suitable for surface imaging, but Venera 8 failed only 11 seconds after touching down due to the extremely harsh conditions. Finally, the first images from the surface of Venus were transmitted back to Earth with the Venera 9 spacecraft, which landed on October 22, 1975. The images that it transmitted back revealed Venus as a barren, rocky, and dry wasteland, with a mixture of sandy and clumpy material that surrounded the lander. Venera 9 transmitted data for 55 minutes before succumbing to the intense heat and pressure on the surface. The last surface missions to Venus came in 1981 with the twin spacecrafts Venera 13 and 14. Venera 13 officially reached Venus on March 1, 1982, and transmitted back the first sounds from another planet. But unfortunately, the sounds that Venera 13 recorded were never made publicly available, so I wasn't able to find them and insert them into the video. Venera 13 lasted 127 minutes on the surface of Venus before failing, which is actually the record for the longest survived time by a spacecraft on Venus. 4 days later, on March 5th, 1982, Venera 14 landed on the surface of Venus, and it also recorded audio from the surface, and unlike 13, 14's recordings are actually available. What you're about to hear in this audio clip is the sound of Venusian wind humming across the hellish landscape of the planet. So, that's going to do it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and just, giving me more motivation to do this science-related content. I really like making these kinds of videos. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching this, and as always, stay curious.